And all these aspects and factors have led to the erosion of legitimacy of the theological political system in Iran. Now, this real crisis of legitimacy is one of the top concerns in the Iranian political system because it determines the continuity of the political rule in Iran. And this is a crisis over, I would say, a deep seated ideological structure inherited from the Iranian Revolution. Most of you are familiar, and this is the piece I wrote for Constellations, most of you are familiar with the two concepts of sovereignties in Iran today because the Iranian Revolution left us with the two concepts of popular sovereignty on the one hand and the theocratic or divine sovereignty or God sovereignty on the other hand. Now, increasingly, of course, the divine sovereignty has been less about religion than about political theology. We should not talk about religion and faith. It's about political theology. As for the popular sovereignty, it has found its due place in social networks and political action of Iranian civil society. And the presence of these two incompatible and conflicting conceptions of sovereignty, authority, and legitimacy have always been a bone of contention in Iranian politics. And it's because of that we have a power struggle among contending forces. Now, what seems evident in this particular crisis is that a whole series of ideological beliefs and political institutions which were inherited from the revolution of 1979 are now put into question. Among these, we find the cherished belief in the Islamic Revolution, in the fact that the Islamic Revolution removed tyranny and established a system of social justice. Nobody believes in that anymore. So actually, the regime's conduct in the past few months has presented serious challenge to its own political institutions while undermining its republican principles by granting no legitimacy to the judgment of the Iranian public sphere. More generally, even those who believed that the system allowed scope of reform and change, these are the reformists, of course, find themselves face to face with an authoritarian structure that uses extreme violence, naked violence actually, to ensure its political survival. So this exceptional concentration of power and uncontested, I would say, control of violence by few institutions in Iran denotes a permanent exercise of absolute sovereignty rather than alluding to a state of emergency. It is precisely the exceptional power of the sovereign that defines the essence of politics in the Iranian political system. And this means that the whole legal order is based on the sovereign judgment and decision and not characterized in a norm. I'm ready to discuss that with you if you don't agree on that point with me. And this implies, what I'm saying is that this implies that there is a permanent tension between the structure of politics in a violent order and the potential for the political. I think that we have to see that. There is a potential for the political as an agency in Iran. We see it in the civic movement, but there is actually there is a structure of politics, a violent politics making actually. And these two are competing with each other as forms of social organization. This is why today's crisis in Iran is not simply an opposition between those who want democracy and those who underline theocratic sovereignty. Is even more than that, I would say. It is a conflict. It is a conflict between the realm of politics, which aims at an absolute sovereignty through the practice of violence, and the realm of the political, which aims at the enlargement, I would say, and expansion of the Iranian civic sphere. As such, I would say that many representatives of the Iranian civil society are not only trying to disobey the legitimacy of the theocratic sovereignty in Iran, but also to discover the better angels of their social nature and try to form and express the moral capital in the Iranian public sphere. So you see, I bring in this concept of moral capital, as we used to talk about social capital, into the Iranian civic movement. I would even add that the level of future success of democratization in Iranian civil society is closely related to the level of moral capital expressed and practiced today in Iranian civil society or Iranian Green Movement. This moral capital has become the yardstick, actually, by which we can measure nonviolent dissent today in Iran. My assessment of the Iranian public sphere today is that the politics of truth finds itself rooted in the practice of truth seekers and right bearers themselves. It's because they refuse to lie and they are searching for truth. It is that is important. I give you very quickly, immediately, an example that brings to my mind. One of the students who was raped in one of the prisons, and there was a video on him on the YouTube. You can go and see him. He gave an interview, and in that interview he said, I'm searching for truth, and that's why I give this interview, but I'm so ashamed that I will not go back and see my parents. And very interesting, he was distinguishing between his role in the civic movement or in civil society and his role in his family, actually, in the private. So for him, the public was more important than the private, even, as somebody who was raped. So it's becoming evident that truth and morality can provide a new starting point for Iranian politics and can have an undeniable political power. It is becoming evident that moral categories like lying in politics and being truthful have their unambiguous content and under certain circumstances are capable of shaking the seemingly unshakable power with all its army of stormtroopers and paramilitary. It is also becoming evident that Iran, with its young population, has become a society that has achieved a moral and political progress through its ability to understand the motives and meanings of dissent as a resistance to unjust laws. I think of those who dare resist violence with the only thing at their disposal, which is their humanity. One should argue that in the past few months in Iran, for many Iranians, resisting unjust laws has become not only a way of life, but the only way to survive as a nation. This means that in these uncertain and dangerous times, where people like James Petrus and the Z magazine see plots and conspiracies everywhere coming from America, Iranian civil society has found the urge to reshape the legitimacy in its own image. I do firmly believe that the foundation of this legitimacy is a moral capital, which could have a certain weight in Iranian politics at a time of serious crisis. It is interesting to underline that while the Iranian political structure is going through a crisis of legitimacy and current power holders have lost moral credibility by virtue of misgovernment and lying in politics, the Iranian civil society is redefining its legitimacy by refounding and refining its republican principles. Now, this republican gesture, as we can call it in Iran, pays attention almost exclusively to the legitimacy of the public space in opposition to